In 1966 came a Doctor Who adventure themed around one character's perverse idea of fun. Question is, was it fun for the audience? Well, that depends on who you ask. Greetings, distinguished followers, chosen chimp here. The Celestial Toymaker was just about the strangest instalment of Doctor Who during the William Hartnell era. There was no real conventional science fiction element to it per se, and it was sure no historical, and that made it completely unique to Doctor Who programming and therefore instantly contentious. Add a quirky setting with clownish characters and lashings of surreal, and you get a story that cannot possibly appeal to everyone. And it didn't. By the time it was actually made, it was overseen by long-term producer Inez Lloyd, although it began as a John Wiles project, and both separate producers had a bit of a tricky time working with William Hartnell. As the biopic that I love banging on about An Adventure in Space and Time shows, William Hartnell had developed a fully functional and also somewhat affectionate relationship with original producer Verity Lambert, who was now completely out of the picture. John Wiles in particular wanted William Hartnell gone, and the Celestial Toymaker was initially pitched as the story to do it. This, folks, was the original Regeneration episode, until it wasn't. Incidental to this was the fact that William Hartnell was on holiday during the filming of 2 of the episodes. So episode 2 and 3 of The Celestial Toymaker has no Doctor, except for some sparse snippets of dialogue which were pre-recorded in advance and a disembodied hand, which isn't even Hartnell's, it's another bloke's. It's reasonable to gauge the absence of a Doctor in a Doctor Who story as a bit of a problem. Also problematic was the fact that the majority of the budget was spent on the previous story, The Ark. The Ark's producer was now gone, leaving Inez Lloyd and co to work simply with what they had. Writer Brian Hales retained writing credit for The Celestial Toymaker, but after the story was handed from one dude to the other, it was eventually Cyberman OG Jerry Davis who penned the version that we finally got on screen, doing so in order to accommodate the budget or lack thereof. It was all a bit of a mess. There's a lot more detail you can go into here about the Celestial Toymaker and its production. Don't even get me started about the George and Margaret thing. But the gist is this: the Celestial Toymaker ended up being a far cry from what it was originally intended to be. It was originally intended to be sort of adult, and it ended up being sort of childish. And this inability to define itself may go some way to explaining why the end result was so weird and silly. It would also be utterly wishy-washy of me to exclude the fact that there are many elements of this story that have neither sat nor aged particularly well politically. The Toymaker is presented declaratively as a Chinese Mandarin, but not played by a Chinese actor. Fortunately, Michael Gough's portrayal of the character appears not to lean into any cringeworthy yellow-faced tropes, and despite the fact that the word celestial has been categorically used as a racial slur against Chinese people during certain points in history, it's generally accepted that the word was attributed in this instance solely to the cosmic aspect of the Toymaker's existence, rather than any kind of invective term. However, not everybody buys into that, and this is still regarded by many as a stereotype. And slightly less open to interpretation is the one-off use of the N-word during a nursery rhyme, which is not good, nor was it back in 1966. I found quite a few articles written over the past couple of decades passionately and understandably condemning the apparent racism in the Celestial Toymaker, and at the same time I gather the sense that the political ropiness found in this story isn't taken as so severe as to blacklist the Celestial Toymaker from Doctor Who history, because it hasn't been. Maybe it should have been blacklisted, or maybe it's enough of a balance to keep this story relevant in today's Doctor Who universe, but also acknowledge its misgivings at every available opportunity. Either way, I fully recognise that people find this character offensive, and the use of the N-word is just outright unjustifiable, regardless of what it was supposed to mean. And my discussion of the Celestial Toymaker in this video is not done under the pretense that these issues don't exist, because they do. Not sure what else to add, other than please be kind to each other in the comments, please. To this day, the Celestial Toymaker remains an infamously divisive story, and not just politically, with some fans and critics really not liking it, and yep, the final product is bold. With no end of comedy spots, absurd characters, a practically non-existent doctor, and a story that's largely set around people messing around on a clearly unsafe but also not particularly thrilling playground. It's easy to see how Stephen and Dodo, who comprise the bulk of this adventure, were annoying company for the audience. The central villain, ably played by Michael Goff, was a cantankerous figure with godly powers, who flexed his desire to trap people and force them to play his games for no reason other than the fact that he was a bit childish and bored. If you don't like circusy clown horn nonsense, then you'd have had a hard time sticking with this for 4 weeks. Though certain games created by the Toymaker have their share of intrigue, a lot of this adventure involves adults playing on children's things. It's like you're watching an episode of Play School. Or if the middle-aged friends of the parents at a summer kids party have too many gin and tonics and suddenly go, "Oh, let's all get on the bouncy castle," and then 5 minutes later somebody's in A&E. And for all these reasons, the Celestial Toymaker would have been a woefully unfulfilling outing for adults seeking the more reliable tropes of Doctor Who. People were expecting science fiction, robots, spaceships, maybe a touch of time travel, and instead, they got that. But it's lucky if they turned on their TVs at all, am I right? Because, as is the case with much of Season 3 of Doctor Who, the Celestial Toymaker fell victim to the apocalyptic scrapping of things by the BBC. Curse you, BBC. Today, the final episode exists fully intact, and the audio for the whole serial is widely available. I listened to it from the Lost TV Episodes Collection Volume 2, which has a few other stories from Series 3 that I'm pretty psyched to dive into at some stage. I gave the Celestial Toymaker the deep dive treatment, listening to episodes 1 to 3 and watching episode 4 and gathering the best impression that I could. To be honest, being restricted to audio isn't a complete disaster. There's enough bubbliness in the dialogue, sound and music to give listeners a serviceable feel for the adventure, though there are moments that I would love to have seen with my actual eyes. Peter Purvis does a sterling job of filling in the gaps for us. Good old Sir Peter of Peter. It's marvellously appropriate that the older version of Stephen takes us through this particular journey. At one point his narration is used to overlap the racist word in the eeny meeny nursery rhyme, which is a wise move, but my favourite moment of Peter Purvis's commentary comes in episode 3, during a particularly heated argument between Sergeant Rugg and Mrs. Wiggs. Mrs. Wiggs is calling him all sorts of names, Sergeant Rugg is throwing her best china on the floor, and Peter Purvis describes this moment as an ensuing orgy of destruction. Well, it's a shame the video no longer exists for that. Full disclosure, it wasn't until after I listened to the audio that I then discovered the reconstructed episodes created by Loose Cannon in 1999, which also had involvement from Peter Purvis. As well as creating imagery of their own design, the Loose Cannon team curated a hell of a lot of stills that I couldn't find anywhere else, an archive which was a great deal vaster than the stuff that I found on the BBC website. So, full disclosure also, a lot of the pics in this vid I grabbed from their vids which can be found on Dailymotion, link in the description. Full credit to Loose Cannon for making a lot of these images very easy for me to find. Anyone affiliated with them who might be watching this, thanks for giving me some lively stuff to work with. There's only so many times I can use the same image of Hartnell looking like a moody old git. I'm also aware that a lot of the people watching this vid also love the animated reimagining by Dino Puff. You can watch it on YouTube and it's a very interesting take on the original content. It puts the story across as something a great deal darker. Very impressive work and highly recommended. With so much trivia surrounding the Celestial Toymaker, I was very excited to dive into this one. And what did I think of it? Well, I'll tell you. But first, I would like to thank the Evil Dalek, my most evil subscriber, for requesting that I review this story over on Patreon. If you have a Doctor Who classic serial that you would like me to review, then head over onto Patreon and become a distinguished follower for just £1 a month. It is there that you can comment in the article I posted or DM me with your request. Maybe just skim through the channel first and make sure that it's a serial I haven't already covered, and please no Dalek or Cybermen stories. Cybermen stories I'm given the Dalek stories I intend to cover right back from the beginning where it all started as soon as I hit that 50 Patreon mark. So if you want to help me that way then please do, and if you've done so already you are awesome and thank you. I've also added an Amazon affiliates link in the description of this video for Doctor Who The Lost TV Episodes Collection 2, which I'm listening to on Audible. So if you want to purchase your own copy of this, and I do genuinely think it's a really cool collection of audio, then please follow the link in the description. I will be taking a small percentage of the profit, so cheers for helping me out. Enough waffle! So episode 1, The Celestial Toy Room, begins with Hartnell's Doctor wiping his nose and phasing out of reality. Good start. According to him, they are in grave danger, as this is some form of attack. When the TARDIS lands in a strange octagonal room, he is not just invisible, but he is intangible as well. He says, whatever is out there, we have to face up to it, which is pretty rich coming from a man that can't be seen or touched. A hypnotic screen is attempting to goad companions Stephen and Dodo with images of their former years. Yes, I will get to that. A striking man in bejeweled robes appears and sends 2 dolls from a Victorian house to play games with Stephen and Dodo. Because of all this, the Doctor is strikingly quick to ascertain that they are in the world of the Celestial Toymaker, and this is pretty much a first in the history of Doctor Who up until that point. Pretty much every alien menace he has encountered previously has been for the first time. Classic, obscure, it all follows the same pattern. It's brand new for the Doctor, but this guy, no. The Doctor describes the Toymaker as a power for evil. He manipulates people and makes them into his plaything. On first meeting each other in person, the Doctor and the Toymaker chat to each other like enemies of old. And do they fill the audience in with their previous encounters? Not really. Only that the Toymaker has been waiting for the Doctor for a very long time. During the start of their ludicrously complex Trilogic Game, the Toymaker says that the last time the Doctor was here, he hoped that he would stay long enough for a game. In turn, the Doctor says that he was wise to leave quick, and that the Toymaker's games are quite notorious. He lures people like a spider does to flies. But the Toymaker says this is absurd. It amuses him to give amusement. This is some great conversation between the Doctor and the Toymaker, and naturally, expanded media jumped all over this. There is a sheer abundance of Toymaker stories in book, comic and audio form. And of course, in order to keep this mighty fine piece of chosen chimp content evergreen, I am going to postulate that you are watching this video after you have seen the 60th anniversary specials, the Star Beast, the Wild Blue Yonder and the Giggle, and also remind you that this video was made before those stories were transmitted, and yet it was a universally accepted fact that this character was definitely the Toymaker. And diving into the original Celestial Toymaker corroborates this in an overwhelming fashion. The set pieces, the dolls, the dancing, it's all there. And the fact that the Doctor and the Toymaker have such an eclectic history means that it's definitely a no-brainer. So, yeah, if it turns out it wasn't, then wow, that's embarrassing. Anyway, the Doctor, Stephen and Dodo are trapped, and the Doctor is completely and utterly not visible. From here on in, the bulk of the story is Stephen and Dodo as they are forced to run a gauntlet of games in order to locate the real TARDIS. If they lose, they stay in the Toymaker's world forever. And the first game they play is against these 2 clowns, Joey and Clara, on a giant snakes and ladders board. It has ropes, skittles, ladders, platforms and tunnels. Stephen is blindfolded and Dodo has to guide him with a series of toots and honks from clown horns. Joey is attempting to cheat by moving some of the platforms around and honking misdirections. Stephen and Dodo play the clowns at their own dirty game and cause Joey to fall off, which means the Doctor's companions win. They cross an exit through what turns out to be a fake TARDIS and the clowns shrink back to wooden dolls. Creepy. Meanwhile, during the Trilogic Game, the Toymaker jests that the Doctor's mind is too old and lazy and weak, and the Doctor says, "How dare you!" I found that bit really funny, sorry. There's no stopping the Doctor from rising to the challenge after that jab. Game on. Another interesting line is when the Toymaker says that he hoped that the time the Doctor spent dabbling in his researches around the universe hasn't dowered him. Then he says, "I need you, I'm bored, there's no one worthy to play against." The Doctor will become his perpetual opponent and they will play endless games together. The Trilogic Game is an intriguing and complex battle of wits. The rules are as follows. 10 triangular play encounters are stacked in pyramids. Pyramids appear in corner A. You're only allowed to move one piece at a time and... Do you know what? I don't understand the rules. Wouldn't be much of a game for the Doctor if I did, to be honest. If you want to know how to play this, then look at the Radio Times clippings from the 1960s. I can barely get my head around Happy Families. They only have 1023 moves, that I can tell you. And the Toymaker can command the pieces to move around of their own accord with his voice, keep that in mind. He makes the Doctor invisible again, all except for one of his hands, and the games begin. On to episode 2, Hall of Dolls, and Stephen and Dodo are tasked with playing a game of chairs. Their opponents are this pompous, larger-than-life king and queen from the family of Hearts. They're basically living playing cards. And these characters are actually quite entertaining, less annoying than the clowns, put it that way. And like Sergeant Rugg and Mrs. Wiggs in the subsequent episode, there are moments when Stephen and Dodo are off scene and these characters take the centre stage, almost as if the story is all about them. By the way, the clowns, the king and queen, and the soldier and kitchen lady in the next chapters are all played by the same actor and actress. Which, for whatever reason that happened, I actually think is a clever touch. It gives credence to this idea that they're all cut from the same model of playing thing that the Toymaker has manifested from his generic collection of action figures. It's pretty interesting. Love or hate these characters, you cannot deny that their performances are brimming with charisma, and they bring this entertaining sense of theatrical bonkersness which is highly energetic if nothing else. I find some of the conversations between one another and Stephen and Dodo pretty fascinating, and I'm also going to come out and say that I think that these scenes would be significantly duller without them. At one point they have a big conversation with Dodo and Stephen, insisting that they are real and that they are as much victims of the Toymaker's twisted games as anybody else, even though they are definitely not. Nice haunting layer creeping through there. And you know what, it's just as well they fill in some story time. The Doctor tries to blab info on the game to his companions, and so the Toymaker takes his speech as well. The Toymaker is talking on behalf of the mute invisible Doctor, and so their game ticks over for the rest of the episode without any real incident. You've also got Cyril, the big bad henchman of the Toymaker, who for the purposes of this game is a knave, aka a jack. And there is also a fool, aka a joker. In the previous episodes, the characters were presented with a riddle. 4 legs, no feet, of arms no lack, it carries no burden on its back. 6 deadly sisters, 7 for choice, call out the servants without voice. It means that out of the 7 chairs, only one of them is safe to sit on. Every character takes a turn trying each chair, snaring numerous traps including a vibrating clamp, an electric current that will fry you into a crisp, a swinging blade, and a thing where you just fade into nothingness. Dodo also sits on one and it nearly freezes her to death before Stephen manages to pull her out just in time. I figure that this was probably the most enjoyable game for audiences to watch at the time, as there was a higher element of actual danger and the anticipation of what the traps were going to be. When it's down to the final 2, the King and Queen somewhat cruelly try to get the Joker to test the final chair on their behalf, but the Joker flat out refuses and then hands in his notice and walks off, which is funny. The King and Queen end up sitting on the chair together like the loving couple that they are, and it collapses and imprisons them. Turns out they were playing cards. Stephen parks his rear in the right chair and the TARDIS appears. Fake again, on to the next game. Episode 3, The Dancing Floor, is split into 2 main sections, the kitchen bit and the dance floor bit. The Toymaker selects 2 new dolls from his kitchen, Sergeant Rugg and Mrs. Wiggs, a stern soldier and a mad kitchen lady. Like the King and Queen, they take centre stage during various moments, and at one point they fall out hard in a chaotic torrent of name-calling and plate smashing. It really is an orgy of destruction. Stephen and Dodo find the key to the next room inside a giant pie, classic, and we're on to the next stage. Now this is an interesting game. Every time you step onto the dance floor, music plays and you start to dance involuntarily. Stephen and Dodo have to make it all the way to the other side or they will be trapped in an eternal dance. The scene opens up with 3 ballerina dolls doing a dance routine, and the accompanying music, triggered by stepping on the dance floor, is cool in a weird sort of way. Kind of like a Mr. Bungle song, if that means anything to anyone. Before the game starts, there's a scene where the Toymaker tells Rug and Wiggs to stop Steven and Dodo, otherwise they will be broken into pieces. So Rug and Wiggs turn up to the dance floor as a smitten couple going to the ball. And again they're trying to solve another riddle, hunt the key to fit the door that leads onto the dancing floor. Then escape the rhythmic beat or you'll forever tap your feet. Not as fun as it sounds. Steven jumps on the dance floor and immediately starts dancing against his will with one of the dolls. He's screaming in panic, he can't even lead. Then Dodo steps on the dance floor and starts dancing involuntarily as well. Wiggs and Rug also jump on, and luckily Steven and Dodo are able to lock up together so they can at least control their movements and dance all the way to the exit, leaving Wiggs and Rug to dance together on this dance floor effectively for an eternity for all we know. Oh no, wait, no they don't, I just remembered the ending. Anyway, this experience prompts Dodo and Steven to have a private conversation about whether or not these dolls have feelings of their own, which to me is kind of interesting because there's a bit of proto-Jerry Davis philosophy poking through here. I mean, people often regard the War Machines as the original experimental Cybermen story, but one could argue that this predates that because you've got these creatures who presume to have some kind of soul, and yet on the surface they appear as nothing more than robotic minions, and that to me kind of carries forward into some of the themes that Jerry Davis explored alongside Kit Pedler in the Cybermen stories. Just a thought. This episode is yet another no-show from the Doctor, hardly anything to even talk about. Apparently he chuckles at one point, but we have to take the Toymaker's word for that. Being the celestial, fully grown adult that he is, the Celestial Toymaker angrily throws his dolls back in the chest and unleashes his ultimate trump card, Cyril, now dressed up as Billy Bunter. Don't say Billy Bunter, copyright. Steven and Dodo find another note. Lady Luck will show the way, win the game or here you'll stay. And so, episode 4, the final test, and finally, some moving image. And with shot compositions like that, yay. The final game is TARDIS Hopscotch, and it's definitely the real TARDIS this time because you can hear it humming like the actual TARDIS does. You throw the dice, the number appears on that indicator thing, and that's the number of spaces you can hop. The floor surrounding these platforms are electrified, so if you step off you will get completely fried. And no, Steven, you can't just move to the end of your own free will, because that will happen. You know, low budget aside, I really like that set. Also preserved in this episode for our viewing pleasure is that bit of stop motion on the Trilogic Game. Cool. The TARDIS hopscotch seems pretty straightforward at first, with Dodo rolling a 3 and Steven rolling a 4. But soon enough, Billy Bunter Cyril, don't call him Billy Bunter, starts throwing in random rules to rig the game in his favour. He's easily the most irritating character they've encountered yet. He's even worse than the clowns with their hoots and pomps. He sprinkles something slippery on the board he's standing on and pretends that his foot is bleeding. But then he gets all excited because he rolls a 5 and then in his own greedy haste he hurriedly steps onto the board, slips off it and then... Ugh, look at that. That's pretty dark, but it couldn't have happened to a more annoying, flippin' idiotic character. Meanwhile, because William Hartnell came back from his holiday, the Toymaker gives the Doctor his voice and his body back. The Doctor brags that the Toymaker has failed to break his concentration throughout the Trilogic Game. A now fully tangible Doctor makes his final move and... okay, are we done here? Well, no, apparently not. The Toymaker can drag them down in defeat also. He manifests in front of them in the flesh and Steven actually goes to punch him. Get in the TARDIS, mate. Bring back Chesterton, that's what I say. Toymaker offers the Doctor the power to corrupt and destroy, and naturally the Doctor says never. However, if he makes his last move and wins, the place vanishes along with them, so it's a catch-22. Everybody loses. The Doctor states that the Toymaker is immortal and has lasted 1,000 years, but also he has the power to create another world and move on, so actually no, it's not a catch-22. They will die, but the Toymaker will survive even if they win the game. Now that is crafty. The Doctor proposes finishing the game in the TARDIS, but the Toymaker sees right through that quick enough, and there's quite an angry standoff between the two titans of cosmic wisdom. In the end, the Doctor ends up fooling the Toymaker by yelling at the board pieces in the Toymaker's voice, from the safety of the TARDIS. Simple but effective, that's what I call that. The Toymaker's realm is destroyed and you get these lovely shots of space. Interesting also is the final conversation where the Doctor says there will be other meetings in other times and that their battle will never end. Hey, you having that one? He then eats this sweet, the last present from the Toymaker. Thank goodness for Doc Holliday. Okay then. Whilst I wouldn't say that time has been kind to the Celestial Toymaker per se, I would say that knowing all we know now about Doctor Who has allowed this to not quite be the sore fun that it once was. The majority of the surreal comedy tones are palatable and they are entertaining, and the supporting characters are such an antithesis to boring that I actually find them largely refreshing. Because William Hartnell was missing for the majority of the story, a somewhat experimental narrative came into play, one where the companions tell the story and even give over to the supporting cast on occasions. There's this enjoyable twisted undertone to the idea that you might die playing these games, but more so that the occupants are as much pawns in the Celestial Toymaker's twisted games as anybody else, even though they are creations of the Celestial Toymaker. I find that if you keep this in mind, the whole theatrical childlike pantomime daftness of this serial takes on a newfound substance, making it possible to view this as something a little less childish and a little more just kind of twisted. A kind of black comedy, if you will. I'm not going to tell you that this is my favourite Doctor Who, nor is it even my favourite of its type. I much prefer The Mind Robber, which is similar in a lot of ways, but with better execution, a higher level of focus, and with greater emphasis on a fairy tale world embedded in a science fiction setting. The balance of surreal, intriguing, and narratively credible is just right, and that is one of my all-time favourite Doctor Who serials, if just for the whole head trippery of it all. Because I really like that sort of thing. Keeping in mind that the political misgivings are kind of wobbling alongside my overall summary here, I do find the Celestial Toymaker a good bit of fun. An experimental piece of work that didn't quite pay off but does serve as an interesting early case study in Doctor Who trying something a little different. It is, for better or worse, a vital piece of Doctor Who history. I am glad it exists, and I do hope those lost episodes turn up one day. What are your thoughts on the Celestial Toymaker, and are there any facts about this serial that I missed? Sound off in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe. Have a good one.